Welcome back to another video. And this time around, I'm essentially going to be using some recent conversation I've had with some coaching friends of mine on top of a couple recent changes I've made to some athletes that I coach who have recently competed. And the overall topic is planning ahead when writing someone's microcycle design in terms of how that layout is going to peak into a meet given, the athlete's demographic and the information that you know about them as an athlete. So I'll be primarily talking about some changes I've made to three athletes of mine in terms of their overall weekly structure and how things are oriented relative to a specific day and how we are planning ahead of time to get a specific day, aka meet day, to peak and for that performance to be predictably strong. When writing someone's training layout, which I've made multiple videos on in the past, so if you haven't checked those out, definitely do that. For example, my how to train into the meet video and the last video that I just made about organizing someone's weekly structure in general, this video kind of ties those two videos together to an extent where, again, the priority here is what are some general considerations we can make when initially writing someone's training block or someone's training layout, like which days are on which days of the week, in order for that to be really easy to peak into meet day without stripping predictability from training in general. So I wrote a couple notes at the top, but some things to keep in mind are the overall structure and the overall design of someone's microcycle really doesn't matter all that much if you cannot peak appropriately into a meet, because the whole purpose of training and getting strong, if you are competing in powerlifting, is to just be able to display that strength on the platform. So if we're unable to do that, then what's the whole point of actually, training for a meet if we can't be strong on the platform? We're kind of defeating, the months and months, maybe even a year over of time in between meets for a given athlete. So again, the first thing I have written is the structure is not as important as how we actually peak that structure into a meet when it comes to performing on meet day in the first place, right? Second thing, similarly, you can have the golden microcycle written out for someone. You can perfect things and have things as flawless as it can get for a given athlete, but all of that predictability can be lost if things are not lined up or peaked appropriately going into a meet. So again, similar to what I just said, that needs to be a consideration in the first place. And it does not matter as much how perfectly you have things lined up, as long as you know, if we are losing all the predictability from how perfectly things have been lined up, then what exactly is the point? Another thing to note is there's not necessarily a one size fits all. The important part is thinking, what am I going to do and how am I going to line up this overall microcycle to peak into a meet and get someone's performance predictably strong on a day? The fourth thing is just keeping that thought in mind ahead of time, because the premise here is planning ahead. A lot of the time, coaches will, and I've been in this situation plenty of times myself, uh, they will write someone's week of training or a block of training, but then they get to the final block of training and they kind of have a oh crap moment where they're a bit stumped on what to do in terms of lining up exposure timing or lining up someone's week of training or frequency or whatever when it comes to peaking into meet day. So to save yourself trouble in the future, it can be a huge help to consider, hey, how am I going to line this week of training or this microcycle up with a meet when it comes time for an athlete to compete? So the premise is overall to plan ahead of time. So like I mentioned, partially why I'm making this video is because it's so fresh in my mind, and I have multiple athletes where I'm kind of restructuring things to get the peaking process for meet day a bit simpler. So here's the first example. This is a lifter of mine who we have a before structure here where she is squatting 2 days a week, benching 4 days a week, and deadlifting 1 day a week, which we are adding a secondary day post-meet. All the reasoning for the one-time deadlift is off topic, but that is just her structure going into her recent meet. Now, things peaked excellent, but the past two times it's been a bit tricky and wonky to get squat to peak in a way that we don't need to adjust something weird. For example, for her, we train into the meet. So what that means is essentially, if you haven't watched the video I made on that topic, we're not doing an additional taper week. We're essentially keeping stimulus high in the areas that we need to, and essentially timing meet day with the final day of a block. So when we do that for squat, it would mean that she's taking her week 5 primary squat just a few days out, which I don't want. So we need to pull back on that session in some capacity, but we also need to line up the timing of exposure for that primary day going into meet day. So if she competes on Saturday, for example, there would need to be something here in the middle of the week that's not typical. And I like typical. I like to orient things as predictably as possible. So with this layout in mind, what things looked like was primary squat was on Monday, secondary squat was on Thursday, her primary deadlift was on Wednesday, and then she had her 4 bench days pretty normally distributed throughout the week on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. What we're doing to essentially plan ahead this time for the next time she competes is we're shifting things a tiny bit so squat is a bit more oriented around meet day, because we know next time she competes, she's going to be competing on a Saturday. Last time was on a Friday, but this time will be on a Saturday. So how we're doing that is we're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The first stone is we are moving that primary squat from Monday to Saturday, and now her typical Thursday secondary squat day is on Tuesday now. So the second stone we're killing is an issue we were running into in training before, was this Wednesday primary deadlift would carry over too much into this Thursday secondary squat. It wouldn't really get in the way of squat. It would just get this Thursday feeling very, very sore and beat up. She pulls conventional, so again, there's a lot of carryover here. So the second bird that we're killing here is, figuratively obviously, is we are essentially flip-flopping those. So it's the best of both worlds, where now we have this primary session on Saturday, which is going to be the day that she competes, and we have that primary deadlift not immediately before a squat session. So what that would look like when it comes time to peak into meet day is we don't change a thing. We don't need to get fancy with shifting a day around or pulling back on a typical week 5 primary session. This time we can just hit her week 5 secondary day, and then boom, it's meet day after that, and her final squat exposure is Tuesday, 4 days out from meet day. With deadlift, we don't also need to change a thing either. We do have this secondary day, but it is on a Saturday, so all we have to do is pull back as usual on this Wednesday, and then everything is per normal. So nice and easy example to start, and you can kind of see how this ties into the original theme. Squat has been a bit wonky for her when it comes to keeping predictability as high as bench and deadlift are when it comes to peaking. So we are shifting that ahead of time so we don't run into this, okay, this is probably going to work scenario, but it's, something that I need to change that's atypical and different than the norm, which I would like to avoid. So similarly, here's another example of an athlete where I'm shifting things around a little bit to get certain days and certain lifts to peak more appropriately into a given meet. This lifter is also going to be competing on a Saturday in November. The meet is already listed on that day, so we can kind of plan for Saturday to be that day. Anyways, what her microcycle structure was written out as before was she would train 5 days a week, with Tuesday and Saturday being her rest day. And I like this example because she was resting on Saturday before, and we've done 2 meets together, and things have peaked appropriately. Like, they've come in strong and a bit stronger than training, which is great. And predictably so. That's the whole overarching theme here is keeping predictability high. The reason that she could not train on Saturday was because of school and overall how busy her life was around that session. And with how I wanted to originally structure things, it worked out in our favor, and we have been making great progress with this layout, despite not being able to train on Saturday. However, she can train on Saturday now. So what we're going to do is essentially identify what areas need to be better and which areas can be better. Similar to the first example, I would like to get squat a little bit more predictably peaked into meet day. What that looks like for her is we can essentially keep her old Sunday and Wednesday layout here written on the left as is. However, an area that contributes to the unpredictability is deadlift, because we can either assuming that a meet is on Saturday, keep her final exposure during meet week. We can keep her primary deadlift on Sunday, but then it's either don't deadlift until Saturday, which I don't want, or we take this really easy deadlift day 2 days out, which I also don't want, or we move it to Wednesday and do this SBD day, which she never does, on top of having her squat session this week. And again, just kind of stripping predictability by doing that on top of exposure timing needing to change. On top of deadlift, yes, we have both of these squat days on convenient days already, meaning she has 2 rest days between her secondary and primary day, and then barring she doesn't compete on Saturday, which she will, we can just keep that final squat exposure on Wednesday. It's just a matter of what that final squat exposure should be. Typically, if we are training into meet with her, aka, again, like I explained already, lining everything up with meet day during the final, essentially her final week of the block, without doing an additional taper week, this final Wednesday squat would be a week 4, she does 4-week blocks, a week 4 primary squat, which I don't want her doing 3 days out. So we do need to pull back on this day, which during our most predictable blocks and how we essentially have things playing out, usually we don't do that. So the way we've reorganized things is similar to the other example. We have put that primary squat on Saturday, and then that secondary day is on Wednesday, and we are keeping exposure timing the same, similar to the other example. With deadlift, we have things a bit shifted around too, keeping her secondary squat and primary deadlift on the same day, which is what we usually have. Keeping exposure timing on deadlift the exact same, right? We have 2 rest days before the primary deadlift, and it's a lot easier to peak the deadlift because she already has this exposure midweek on Wednesday. We really just need to pull back on that session and taper into meet day. So it's very simple, and we do not need to shift anything around. As a bonus, like I said, she was not able to train on Saturday before. Now she can. So what we're going to be doing is we're just already shifting this bench, layout later into the week, because what we did for this current meet was she already competed on Friday, or for this recent meet she competed on Friday. We just essentially didn't need to change a thing, just did Monday, Wednesday, Friday as normal. And what we could do hypothetically if we kept that layout was shift everything back a day during the week of her meet to line up exposure timing and keep everything at the same rate there. But it makes it easier now that she can train on Saturday to just bump that primary bench on Saturday as well. Because the other 2 examples I just gave were squat, I'm going to give an example for deadlift. However, I will say this can be done for any lift. And if you've watched my YouTube before or followed me on Instagram for a while, I've mentioned a lot that I've really tried to get a primary bench session specifically on the day of someone's meet, or at least as close as possible to it. Primarily because, and again, I've said this a lot on YouTube, so pretty redundant here, but bench is the highest frequency for pretty much every single athlete, and because of that, it makes it the hardest for one specific day to be the strongest. So I do like to get that the day that we're trying to be the strongest to be lined up with meet. But back to the point, this can be done with any lift, and the overall structure of someone's microcycle can be lined up on any lift with, keeping predictability as high as you possibly can going into a meet and getting that to be displayed on a specific day. So here with this athlete on deadlift, we are shifting things around to essentially get that primary session on Saturday. You can kind of see the overarching theme is keeping predictability high, making the day of someone's meet, aka for the most part Saturday or Sunday oftentimes. For national meets, maybe a Thursday or Friday. But it's to line the session that you're trying to get strong in training with meet day. And you can kind of see that's the overarching theme here, like I said. So the before layout is she was squatting twice a week, deadlifting twice a week, and benching 4 times a week. Bench, we already have lined up with that Saturday, if she is on a Saturday for her next meet. Squat is a bit weird. And again, what we're trying to do here is mainly with deadlift, but this is also partially changing squat. It was a bit weird because we have her Monday primary squat, secondary on Thursday, but then what we need to do is there's got to be something happening in between Monday and Saturday to line up exposure timing with squat on meet day. And while this layout is completely viable, there just needs to be something different because the exposure timing going into her primary squat, we cannot replicate that. She would need to either take her final squat on Tuesday and that's it, but that means we're going 4 days with no squatting prior to that. So if you didn't follow what I just said there, pretend this is a week 3. She runs 4-week blocks, and we're trying to line up that 4th week with meet day. Her week 3, she'd take her primary on Monday, secondary on Thursday. But then we would need to line up exposure timing with that primary day with meet day. So the exposure timing going to her typical primary squat is 1, 2, 3 rest days. Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 3 rest days going to the primary Monday. But if we want to line that up with the Saturday meet day, the final squat exposure would need to be Tuesday. So we would either have to move that primary squat to Tuesday and then don't squat until Saturday, which I'm not really a fan of, because then if we did that, there would be 4 days of no squatting, or we keep it on Monday and then we would need to squat on Wednesday or Thursday, or move this Monday to Sunday. Then we're just adjusting a lot, which is fine, but for the final week of someone's prep that we are peaking into a meet, I would prefer not to do that. I'd rather we just have it planned out and laid out ahead of time, which I'm a huge fan of, and that's why I do all these primary days on Saturday, or meet day, whatever day someone is competing. But that's the reasoning for wanting to change squat. And then for deadlift, another easy shift is to just get this primary day on Saturday. However, it's not as big of a deal because during meet week, we can just bump this secondary day to Tuesday to line up the exposure timing there. But then the caveat is that we're doing squat on Monday and deadlift on Tuesday, which could cause a lot of last minute like lower back fatigue or overlap between lifts during the final week of meet prep, which we don't want. So we are just reshifting her layout to plan ahead and move around this ahead of time. So when the time comes to peak and orient things into a meet, we don't need to get jumbled up like this. So what we're doing is we are taking this Monday squat deadlift session and moving it to Tuesday, bringing that deadlift session to Saturday. And then the reason for bringing this secondary squat to Saturday as well is outside of the point. That was from a fatigue and pain perspective. So we can keep this on Friday, I guess, for the example, for consistency's sake. But the reasoning for the changes, deadlift is pretty straightforward. We're getting the primary day on Saturday, and all we have to do with squat and deadlift being in the same day, we don't need to shift it, like I mentioned, but we would hypothetically need to do to keep predictability as high as possible, is just do it on Tuesday, as we always do. And then what I like about a Tuesday squat is it's already essentially lined up from an exposure timing perspective. Again, in this example, we can keep the secondary squat on Friday. We oriented things to be on a Saturday for her, just in her individual example, but if we move it on Saturday, we can just go boom, 1, 2, 3 rest days, meet day, right? And that's why the Tuesday Friday layout here works nicely. Or in the example of us actually doing it on Saturday, it would not be the end of the world to have this final final squat session be on a Tuesday. However, we can also just simply move it to Wednesday. But again, the downside there is that we do have not doing this squat and deadlift session on the same day anymore. So again, it would be a better example to have this secondary be on Friday for consistency's sake. But I literally copied and pasted this. So for her, that was more of a pain and fatigue overlap perspective there. But from exposure timing perspective, it makes more sense to be on Friday. Either way, the point is that this layout works better for peaking. And that is how we are switching things and orienting a little bit ahead of time to make the adjustments going into someone's meet very, very minimal. So again, it's something we are planning ahead for. To kind of come full circle here, with giving those 3 examples, you can kind of see we're following the general guidelines and the general rules and things to keep in mind when essentially keeping this entire topic in mind. We're planning ahead. We're understanding that we can have a golden microcycle, but it needs to be with peaking and lining things up for meet day considered. And there's also no one size fits all. There's no given answer for how to do this. It's essentially the point is, how can we keep predictability high going into a meet, and how can we plan ahead of time to get the job done in that regard? So If you enjoyed the video, if all of this makes sense, or if there's any questions, feel free to leave a comment, or give some examples of your own if you are an athlete or a coach where this is a topic relevant to you. But besides that, I'll see you guys at the next video.